And our aim is to create spaces for complex learning, for honest reflection, and respectful dialogue that will encourage us to think critically about our relationship to what is taking place in Palestine. So I'd like to thank all of the members of our coalition for all of their work, for their devotion, for their solidarity. And I also want to thank the University of San Diego for providing the physical and intellectual space that enables us to hold this teaching. And I would very much like to thank you all for coming and spending your evening with us, especially the students, because this whole process started as a way to engage our students to think critically about Palestine and what is taking place there. Before I introduce our speakers, I just want to mention that a couple of events that are taking place during this month of November as part of the teach-in. So on Monday, November 11th, from 6 to 8 p.m., there's a lecture by Dr. Laura Sheehy and Dr. Stephen Sheehy. The lecture is titled Resistance Keeps Us Sane, Rejecting Settler Colonial Reality Bending. And there's some flyers over there if anybody would like one. Mari will pass them around. And then on Thursday, November 21st, from 6:30, I'm sorry, let me go back. The talk on Mondays in Manchester Auditorium, which is Manchester Hall across that green space of campus. On Thursday, November 21st, in this room, from 6:30 to 8 p.m., Reverend Mitri Raheb will give a lecture. We'll talk about his book, Decolonizing Palestine, the Land, the People, the Bible. Reverend Raheb is a Palestinian priest. He's the founder and director of Dar Kelima University in Bethlehem. And Dar Kelima is the only university that is completely focused on art and culture in Palestine. So for all of you students, if there are art students in here and you want to do your MA in Palestine, they just started an MA program 2 years ago. So learn your Arabic and go do your MA in Palestine. There are also events in December. And if you are not on our mailing list and would like to get on it, I'll pass around some paper and please get on it and I'll send you the calendar and you'll get almost weekly emails. So the title of tonight's panel is The Art of Survival and Resistance. And after the result of last night's election, the topic of tonight's panel couldn't be timelier, as I'm convinced more than ever that survival and resistance need to be not only our unwavering motto, but really the fuel that will drive our actions for the next 4 years, or possibly even the next 14 years. Tonight's panel would address the roles of the visual arts in defining settler colonial atrocities and genocidal actions against people that have been occupied, displaced, and dispossessed of their histories, their culture, their language, and their lives. In contemplating reoccurring history of settler colonial repression, I find inspiration in the work of the Native American scholar Gerald Visnor, who coined the term survivance, a combination of two words, survival and resistance, to describe the creative resilience of the indigenous peoples of the America against long and cruel histories of cultural and physical genocides. The concept of survivance applies to the struggle of all colonized populations, as cultures of survivance are defined by an active indigenous presence against imposed political, physical, and psychological absence. Acts of survivance underline a dynamic will of the individual and underscore the power of the collective by creatively employing memories, personal and communal stories, as well as tales of ancient customs and evolving traditions to convey a living culture that refuses to disappear. The art of survivance is a corrective act against imposed cultural erasure. It serves as an antidote to forgetting indigenous history, customs, and tradition, while helping to ensure that Native experiences are preserved and that current and future generations are well informed. The creative arts, including the diverse field of visual arts, might be the best vehicle for informing, developing, and sustaining cultures of survivance. The ability of artists to witness, interpret, assemble, and creatively construct narratives of political, cultural, and spiritual resistance and survival provides communities of viewers with the potential to imagine and implement change. So I'm extremely grateful to have our three speakers join us this evening and to present examples of Indigenous survival and resistance from three distinct cultures. I really wish they were here in person, but I'm very grateful that they were able to join us in this webinar. And at the end of their presentations, they will respond to questions from the in-house audience as well as the online audience. So I'll begin the introduction with Candice Hopkins, who is a citizen of the Carcross Tagish First Nation and lives in Red Hook, New York. Her writing, curatorial practice explore the intersections of history, contemporary art, and indigeneity. She's executive director and chief curator of Forge Projects, a Native-led organization dedicated to supporting Native leaders in art and culture. Candice is the curator of numerous exhibitions, and I'll list just a couple, including the recent exhibit, Indian Theater, Native Performance Art and Self-Determination since 1969, that was held at the Hessel Museum. She was the senior curator for the inaugural 2019 and 2022 editions of the Toronto Biennial of Art, and was part of the curatorial team for the Canadian Pavilion of the 58th Venice Biennale. Her notable essays include The Gilded Gaze, Wealth and Economies on the Colonial Frontier, that was published in Documenta 14 Reader, Outlawed Social Life, and that was published in South as State of Mind, and The Appropriation Debates or the Gallows of History, in Saturation, Race, Art, and the Circulation of Value, published by MIT Press and the New Museum in 2020. And the list can go on, but Candice, I hope you don't mind that I trimmed your biography a bit. Next, I'd like to introduce Susan Greene, who's a multidisciplinary visual artist. She's a clinical psychologist and longtime activist for justice in Palestine. Susan has been developing community-based mural projects in Palestine since 1988. And she is also the founder and director of Art Forces, a community-led public art enterprise that has developed numerous ambitious mural projects, most of them along the West Coast, but also in Palestine. I've had the great privilege of working with Susan on a few mural projects in the West Bank and in Gaza. The work that she will discuss this evening is an ongoing community-based project that is being developed in the critically threatened ancient Palestinian neighborhood of Silwan in Jerusalem. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Lydia Bodnar-Balahutrak, who's a Ukrainian-American visual artist and educator based in Houston, Texas. She received the 2022-2023 Fulbright U.S. Scholar Award for a research project in Ukraine to study contemporary issues-oriented art making in that country. But due to the war, the project was reassigned to Poland, where Lydia met and exhibited with Ukrainian artists who addressed the war, loss, and displacement. In her own work, she explores cultural, social, political narratives by combining collage, text, and figuration. Lydia had a major exhibition titled Lamentation earlier this year at Texas A&M University, and has an exhibition of new work opening in Houston, Texas on January 18, 2025, and maybe she can give us more detail. So I would like to welcome you all, and Candice is going to go first. So what I'm going to do is switch screens here so that we just see speaker. Candice, you're on.
Thank you, John. I'm really grateful to be here. And John, thank you for the invitation. I'm also grateful to be here to share space with Susan and Lydia and learn from all of you, particularly in this on this day and in this moment. I'm going to share a little bit of where I'm from, because as John has shared already in the introduction, this is also a story of survivance. This is the mountain on where my grandmother's ashes, Vera Matson's ashes, are buried, because she wanted to overlook our traditional village. She wanted to overlook where we're from in Carcross, Yukon, in the settler nation now known as Canada. But I am a citizen of Carcross Tagish First Nation because we have the first contemporary land agreement in Yukon history. And that land agreement enables us to be citizens, again, of our territories. A very important political move that has also enabled us to enact many environmental protections in our lands, including a permanent ban on fracking in these areas. So this is the lake that we look onto. But I want to share as well that this is our social life. This was our social life, and this is a part of our social life again. We are potlatch people. Potlatch is an economic system. It's a system of governance. It's a system of survivance. It's a system of the redistribution of wealth to enable the well-being of not only our community, but any community that we were hosting as our guests. This system was deeply disturbing to colonial governments and settlers when they first started coming west. I think part of the reason that was deeply disturbing is because for us, status is bestowed upon those who are the best host. So in many ways, those who have the most to give. So the exact opposite of early capitalism and the exact opposite of behavior modeled now in, I would say, all settler states. So you see us here with our regalia, you see us here with our wealth, and our regalia designates and is a way of displaying also our clan relationships. I'm going to study clan. When gold was found in our lands, this was a settler response. So these were ships that came down to Seattle, they came down to Oregon, and then this led a rush of prospectors to our area. There were over 100,000 people that came in a matter of months, and they came up these stairs that were made of ice. And they considered us, the natives, to either be their laborers, to be the people who were charging too high a tolls to pass these mountains, or to be almost entirely absent in the land. So I see these now as images of a certain kind of colonialism. And I think we know that there's different kinds of colonialisms. There's settler colonialism, but there's also extractive colonialism. And I often feel like extractive colonialism can both kind of predate and in many cases post-date settler colonialism. So this was very firmly in the extractive stage. Following that stage of extraction, after many of the prospectors left, what replaced them were foreign religions and churches. So these are residential schools. And for those who don't know about the history of residential schools in Canada or boarding schools in the United States, I think it's really worth looking deeper into them. They were mandated so that every single Native child in Canada, up until the 1960s, legally had to attend these schools because we were considered legal wards of the state. So we didn't belong to our parents. We belonged to the government. And these were places of extreme dispossession and extreme inequities of power. There was abuses that I won't detail because they're deeply traumatic, but they included every kind and form of abuse you can imagine. And this was the school that my grandmother and all of her siblings went to, because they were intended to create not only cultural genocide, and that has been found through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, but also effective citizens to the settler nation. So you can see the shift, obviously, in not only what people are wearing, but what they're doing. And as my grandmother Vera relayed to me, her time in the residential school, she very quickly realized that they weren't about education, they were about creating laborers. But where I want to turn to survivance, and this is going to be a very, very short history lesson of my land, but one that gives me a lot of hope. And I think we need hope in these times, because I think hope is a form of organizing, hope is a form of planning. And I think even when, you know, there's been an attempt to reduce our people to just shards of what we were, even in those shards, we can see reflections of our culture, right? So many of us took to organizing, some in my family, some in nearby clans. And now the center of our village is a commons. And so this is a dance group who's dancing in the middle of our commons. And this has been formed as part of an economic redistribution initiative in our lands. So we had to do that by developing a corporation. But the corporation has similar intents to the original potlatches, and that is to support the well-being of the community. When this dance group was first being formed in the early 2000s, it was the first contemporary dance group that had sung these songs in a long time. And the idea was to begin with dance, because the idea was that dance might again reinvigorate our language, which has been, at least in inland Yukon, sleeping. The Tlingit language has been sleeping for a while. There's not so many fluent speakers anymore. And what was found through the dance group is that then the children started singing the songs. And when they were singing the songs, of course, they were singing in our language. And our language comes from the land. So again, our voices are reflecting the land. And for us, this is really important. At the center of the commons, importantly, at the center of these buildings is a place to gather. And that, once again, is the heart of our community. So I bring this close to the work that I do at the organization I run now with a team of 7 called Forge Project. Forge Project is a center that supports Native leaders in art and culture. We are on traditional Mahikaniak land. So here, in order to enter the website of Forge, you must acknowledge the land. And that's a necessary step for us, because for too long, Indigenous people have been seen as the resource for others, instead of those who need to be resourced by others. Part of what our model of Forge is the understanding that one of the ways that we can create justice in these lands in the United States is through the redistribution of settler wealth. And so that's really at the foundation of this project as well. And that's intentionally a provocation. And it's intentionally a provocation because the lands that we are guests on at Forge Project, and what's known often in English as the Hudson Valley, is actually the Mahikanatuk Valley. So that is the waters that run both ways, because the Hudson there is an estuary, and it indeed runs both ways. But it is a place of very radical Indigenous removal, starting in the late 1600s, accelerating in the 1700s, to the point where Mohican people, and we're on Mohican land, were forcibly removed a total of 7 times, all the way to Wisconsin. So over 1,000 miles from the lands, from their traditional homelands. So what does it mean to be an Indigenous-centered organization in a place of such radical removal, of such dispossession? How do we enable Indigenous placemaking in the face of these histories? So this is the kind of work that we busy ourselves in now. So at Forge, we recognize and we understand the potential of radical hospitality. We enable gatherings because we think one of the most important things we can do, particularly in this region, in the Mahikanatek Valley region, is to create places where Indigenous folks can come together and they can gather, they can share food, we can share stories, we can share knowledge, because those are things that haven't happened in this place in a really long time. And that in and of itself is deeply important. We run a fellowship program, and in this first year, we supported in 2021, so we started in 2021, we supported 4 fellows. We supported Brock Schreiber, who's there on the left of my screen. He's dedicated his life project to reawakening a sleeping language, which is Mohican, so that his children will be the first in a few generations to have grown up only speaking Mohican. Chris Cornelius next to him is an Oneida architect, and he's in fact the first Native architect to lead any architecture program in any university in the United States in US history. And he's at the University of New Mexico. He really wants us to think of how architecture and buildings can be kin to the land instead of something that's placed on the land. And also pushes us to think of, those things that are temporary on the land as having a lifespan. We often don't think of buildings as having lifespans. We often don't think of buildings as being kin. But I think that's the difference that happens when you have someone who's coming from his perspective, looking at the built environment. And beside him is Sky Hopinka, who's a Loseño and Ho-Chunk filmmaker and a poet, who's actually performing tonight with my husband down here in the Lower East Side at a place called The Stone, performing a concert. And Sky's work through his poems, which read like lyrics, are ways to meditate not only on the land itself, but the histories that are sedimented in it and the histories that rise to its surface. And beside him is Jasmine Niosh, and Jasmine Niosh is on our Indigenous Steering Council. She's a legal scholar and an academic based at the University of Michigan. So one of the questions that we had in organizing this new Indigenous organization is, how do we ensure that we also follow Indigenous leadership and governance as long as the organization is alive? So one of the ways that we've done that is we've created an Indigenous Steering Council, and that council actually sits above the board, and they provide high-level vision and direction for us. But to turn back to the fellows and to share the way that the fellowship is structured is each of them receives a Cash Award. Now they're adjudicated by a jury of their peers. And when they come to Forge, we host them for 3 weeks, and we put no restrictions on their time. Part of that is so that it can be entirely self-determined by the people that we seek to support, but also because we want to model non-extractive relationships, particularly with Indigenous people in our communities. We want others to model non-extractive relationships too. So this is a White Mountain Apache experimental violinist, Laura Ortman, and she turned one of the rooms of the guest house into a recording studio for the duration of her fellowship. And at the time, she was recording a soundtrack for a series on Showtime that was dedicated to the stories of the murdered and missing Indigenous women epidemic, which is an epidemic in the United States. It's an epidemic in Canada. It's an epidemic in Mexico. And it's an epidemic in many other countries south of us. And I worry now with this election that it's only going to get worse. So as I shared before, one of the things that we do at Forge is we share food, because with the sharing of food is the sharing of stories. It's also the creation of solidarity networks. We not only share food, but we share the making of food together too. We also invite Indigenous chefs to come and talk about their work. And often that's at the intersection of food justice and these solidarity networks that many Indigenous chefs are enacting and are creating across the Americas. But importantly, our most central relationship is with Stockbridge-Munsee community. So those are the core group of Mohicans who were displaced from the region where Forge now sits. So this is their farm, and this is their food program near Bowler, Wisconsin, where they've created thousands of tons of safe and nutritious food for their community that they sell at very low cost, and also create elder food boxes as a way to sustain their health and the health of their community. And they're bringing back heirloom and native seeds. This is Monique Tyndall, who's also on our Indigenous Steering Council, and she's the Director of Cultural Affairs at Stockbridge-Munsee community. And so one of the things that was really important for us is to establish formal diplomatic relations with Stockbridge-Munsee community as part of the formation of our organization. So that means that we have a signed memorandum of understanding with the community that outlines our shared values, but also what our commitment that our organization has to Stockbridge-Munsee community. And that's a document that was shaped by Monique together with my colleague Sarah Bascara-Dilly over the course of more than 1 year. And most importantly, as part of that document, there are 2 appendices. One is centered on Indigenous intellectual property rights. The other is centered on Forge and the 40 acres that we are custodians of, and the 20 acres nearby, as formal cultural easement for Stockbridge-Munsee community. So the reason I'm sharing this is because I think it's deeply important that institutions, particularly ones that are engaged in creating land acknowledgements, engaged in creating relationships with Indigenous communities, that you underscore that with not only your diplomacy, but that you put it in writing so that commitment is really firm. One of the things that Monique asked us when we first started working with us is, what are you doing that's in benefit to my community? So I think first and foremost, any collaborations with Indigenous communities need to center that question. So I want to just end here because I don't want to take up too much time and space, but I'll also share a little bit more about what we do with our collection by way of conclusion. But a lot of what we do is to share what folks are doing and to create platforms for them, for their work, for their knowledge, for it to be contextualized in ways that are not extractive, but contextualized in ways that are relational and can move at the speed of trust. So this is Lucille Grignon, who's a seed saver and is from Stockbridge-Munsee community. She's Mohican with her daughter. And this is a really special moment when her daughter was sharing blue corn seeds together with Sarah, that then we were able to plant in the ground. Because I think it's these kinds of seeds that we need to remember, we need to protect. Seeds in some cases can stay dormant for more than 100 years. That's why seed banks can be a really important part of the foundation of a culture whenever a culture is ready to plant them and to steward them. And much more than that, what we realized as temporary custodians of this land is that first we needed to center the health of the land itself we're on. A lot of institutions, especially art institutions, spend time really, I think, obsessing about what's going on the inside of their buildings and what the outside of their buildings look like, but they very rarely think of the health of the land that they're sitting on. So we began this first by simply stopping mowing to see what seeds were dormant. Then we worked with allied botanists and an allied landscape architect, and this is Claudia Vispo, who's our allied botanist, to rematriate and remediate the land. Then we worked together with volunteers and workdays to try to transform other plots of land in nearby areas And since this has happened, this has given me another idea of what survivance might mean. Because now this meadow is not just diverse in terms of its plant life, but at certain times when you visit it, the sound of the insects are so loud that it's deafening. And to me, that's hope. So I'll stop sharing there.
Thank you very much, Candice. The audience will have a chance to ask questions in a bit, but I'm going to ask Susan to come on and get her slideshow ready. Thank you, Candice.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you, John, very much for this invitation. Thank you very much to my co-presenters. I'm really honored to be here with you. I'm going to talk about Art Forces, which is an art and activist organization that started in 2001. And it's concerned with borders and migrants, refugees, and the dispossessed, and memory and trauma, and the use of culture and art to cope and to make meaning, and to, maybe most importantly, to resist. I'm Jewish American. My grandparents came here in the late 1800s. They were escaping persecution and wound up on land that was not theirs. I don't think they knew this, actually, but I do, and so I want to acknowledge that, and that I remain on Indigenous land, unceded Indigenous land, and I'm going to dive in now to this, to the stories of my work in Palestine. So this is how Palestine has evolved. This only goes up to 2010. So you can see how the land has really shifted. And what was Palestinian land is smaller and smaller, and now it's even much smaller. This is the actual, one of the moments of truth that I had in 1987, where I came across this article, and it says, the crowd cheers Israel's Yitzhak Shamir in Jerusalem, who says all American Jewry stands with us. So that was something I needed to really face as an American Jew, because, you know, if I didn't address this, then I was colluding with the colonization of Palestine. So this shows the West Bank, and it shows all the checkpoints that stop Palestinian movement, and that's one of the things that the occupation does, is it really prevents Palestinians from moving freely in so many ways. And so a trip that normally would take 20 minutes now takes 2 hours. And here's another map that shows the wall that Israel built, and here is a photograph of it. And I'm going to briefly talk about a project that actually John was part of, that took place in 2004, 2005, and in 2011. This is the Amr family, and they're refugees from inside 48, in what is known as Israel. And they lived in a tent for 10 years in Masha, which is in the West Bank. This is their home. This is the way that their house is surrounded on 4 sides by walls and fences, electric fences. These are the signs that are all over the fences. And this is in 2004, when I was invited by the Amr family and other solidarity organizations to do a mural with the kids. And this is on the concrete apartheid wall that faces the front door of the family. This is what the view is of their home. They used to be able to see their village and hear their village, and now are totally cut off. And on the day that we were painting, there are jeeps and army all around. This is the final mural, and the Eric Drucker, who's a political artist, was with us, and he painted this phoenix. This is what the view from the front door looked like before, and this is what it looked like after. And when I visited with the family, you can see John in there. They said, "Hey, we need you to come back and do the sky." So we came back with a delegation of 11 people who were there in solidarity with the family, with Palestine, and also other organizations in the area, Palestinian organizations. One was called Flowers Against the Occupation. And we were kicked out again by the army. So we had to leave. And this is what it looked like, what the mural looked like from the front entrance of the family's home. And the next day, after the army had forced us to leave, I should mention that for a year, the family had to lock themselves in and out of the gate, and had to call the army to let them to gain entrance and exit from their homes. We left all the paint, and Munira started to paint the inside of her house. And so, standing in the living room, the blue of the mural and the blue of her painting, I could see out of my peripheral vision. And so this act of creative control and this resistance art project had come inside the house, because when the soldiers made us leave, she did not stop painting. And in 2011, I had an opportunity to visit the family again, and the mural was faded, and I asked if they would like it to be restored. And they said no. The mural just reminds us of this horrible situation that we're living in, and the kids have grown up and they moved on. And so what we'd like you to do is paint it out. And so this is Hani Amr, who's painting out the mural. Hani told me that after the mural was painted, his kids were able to play outside again because it made them feel like they had ownership of their space. That the mural project made the kids feel like they could live, and they remembered who painted each section of the mural. But they were grown up, they didn't need it, and so they wanted it painted out, and they wanted to write poetry on the wall. But they liked the idea of keeping the phoenix. Hani has since passed away, and he never got to see Palestine free. I'm going to move on really as quickly as I can to Eyewitness Silwan, which is a project in occupied Jerusalem. And this is Silwan here, and you can see Aqsa in the background. And this is a map showing where some of the buildings are that are have either been taken over or are going to be taken over. And Silwan has been renamed by Israel and its tourist industry and archaeological industry, the City of David. And they're trying to use biblical history and Bible stories to justify the modern Israeli state and its confiscation of land, houses, and dispossession of Palestinians. And so hundreds of people have been expelled from Silwan, and there are excavations that just look for proof of Jewish history as a way to prove that only Jews have the right to the city. And so the project consists largely of eyes that are painted either directly on the wall or on banners or large stickers and glued to the wall. And I'm going to go through some of them. So they're eyes of famous people, leaders, writers, Hassan Kanafani, Nasser, who's a resident who's been fighting for years to keep her home. And there's a cultural center who's the partner in the project called the Mada Creative Center. And this is the director who says, we want to keep our children away from the violence, away from the settlers and the army. We want to give them back a little bit of their childhood. And I'm going to show a film now.
أن تراني في عتمتك شيء مستحيل، أما أنا فأراك.
We're ready. We'll start, and then I'm thinking over the next month, you can work here more with the kids, and then we can also have kids tomorrow.
مشروعنا شهداً على سلوان عزيز علي لأنه أنا سكنت بسلوان لأكثر من 15 سنة وانتقلت على مكان تاني، وعن طريق هذا المشروع أنا رجعت لهون. رجع جمعني في حدا من أعز الناس على قلبي اللي هي جنان. أنا وجنان كنا مع بعض بسلوان بطفولتنا نلعب. إني أرجع هون وفي هذا العمر وإني أكون في سلوان كمان مرة ومع صاحبتي، هذا الإشي كتير حلو.
في كتير ناس بالعالم ما بيعرفوا شو بصير بسلوان،
بس من بعد المشروع صارت الرسومات تلفت الناس إنها تيجي لسلوان. كثير بنقابل ناس أجانب أو عرب إنه بشوفوا العيون من ورا، بصيروا يمشوا بوصلوا الحي، من هون نتلاقى معهم بصيروا يحكوا لنا شو فكرة المشروع وبيعرفوا أكثر عن المشروع شو بصير بحي بطن الهواء. كمان انه احنا مش بس بنرسم جداريات لشخصيات كمان معينه او بتسلط الضوء بس على القضيه الاساسيه، برضه بنشتغل على نفسيه الاطفال، فبنحاول نرسم جداريات تخلي تركيزهم على الالوان، على الحيطان، على الحياه بشكل عام.
احنا بدنا نرجع شوي من طفولتهم، الابداع بخليهم يحسوا انهم اقوى.
حلمي ان اطلع برضه محاميه وادافع عن وطني.
مش إشي عادي بأنه كل هاي الزخرفات والرسومات اللي ممكن تعبر عن هوية الإنسان العربي والفلسطيني اللي بعيش في القدس نقدر نبين هذه الهوية بسهولة، خصوصا أنه هذا الشارع فيه كثير مستوطنين ساكنين، فهو شارع مشترك وما بيقدر الإنسان الفلسطيني يقدر يسوي اللي بده إياه ويبين هويته ويعبر عن نفسه.
So I'm going to talk about very briefly more about who the eyes are representing. Part of the goal of the project is to make connections between what's happening in Palestine and Silwan and struggles other places in the world. And so these are the eyes of Alex Nieto, an American citizen who was killed by police in San Francisco. And a writer, Rebecca Solnit, wrote, Nieto died because a series of white men saw him as a menacing intruder in the place he had spent his whole life. John Berger's eyes are on the wall. Rachel Corrie, who was killed in Gaza in 2003. She was 23 years old, crushed by an Israeli bulldozer. These are the eyes of Hamid Musa, and this is a photo from John Holika's series, Faces from Erased Places. And so you can see here how it was the technology that we used allows us to include people who live far away, can't travel for various reasons, aren't allowed to, it's not so, and work on walls that are hard to reach. All of the walls in Silwan that have murals are on the homes of Palestinians who are being threatened with expulsion. And these are some of the kids that we worked with. The neighborhood is full of our colors now. It's our place. We will never leave. Here, these are two of the team members, the core members, Janan and Manar. And these are the eyes of Malcolm X by Emory Douglas, who is a Minister of Culture for the Black Panther Party. And we took some of the images and made them into posters in October after the genocide started to protest and demand a permanent ceasefire. The eyes of George Perry Floyd, who was killed by police in the US. Palestinians were very moved by his story and wanted to really make this kind of connection. So all of these eyes are overlooking Silwan or overlooking the colonization of Silwan. This is a kid's mural, freedom. It says Huwi in Arabic. It means freedom. These are the eyes of a young man that was killed in Button el Hawa by settler guards. These eyes were by an iconic artist, Slimane Mansour. We were very honored to have his contribution. And this, here I'm talking about the sunrise image here, Sharuk, was by a Gazan artist. And we started working with him before the genocide started. And now I'm going to go super fast because I'm running out of time. I ran out of time. And so this is a perfect example of someone who couldn't travel even before the genocide. Palestinians in Gaza can rarely travel to Jerusalem. And so we developed this image with him, and then we were able to install it He says, I truly cherish that it is there, and I hope that I can go there to Jerusalem and do more murals and participate with the people there, because we are all one. We are all one body. And this is some of the work that he's doing on the tents. He's been displaced 15 times from his home in Gaza. Iyad al-Halak, who was killed by occupation forces, and Che Guevara is on the wall. And the eyes are everywhere and have even become part of the flowers. And I will end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. There'll be time for questions coming up. And Lydia, if we could get you to put your PowerPoint up, that would be wonderful.
I need to unmute myself. I'm very privileged to be part of this panel presentation. I'm Ukrainian American, as John had introduced. I was born in the United States, but my parents and family were refugees from Ukraine. So what I want to do is to share with you particularly tragic history in Ukraine that few people still don't know about. And because there is a war raging now in Ukraine, and it is a genocidal war, this Holodomor means death by starvation. It was artificially orchestrated by Stalin in 1932-33, along with other horrible genocidal acts. As an artist, I did series of works related to the Holodomor, and that's what I want to share with you. I know that there isn't much time to read the text, so I will only read the text that I feel is important to flesh out the history of the Holodomor. But concerning my artwork, all the pieces that you will see are small pieces, and they are two series called fragments and also another kind of icon. I'll talk a little bit about the pieces and then just show them one by one. I'd like to read out loud, though, this quote by Nikos Kazantzakis. Man can feel no religious awe more genuine and profound than the awe he feels treading the ground where his ancestors, his roots, repose. Your own feet sprout roots which descend into the immortal roots of the dead. And I felt this kind of awe upon my first visit to my ancestral homeland of Ukraine. It happened in 1991 via a grant that I received. And my stay in Ukraine opened my eyes and soul to a land beautiful but ravaged by the Soviet regime, a long-suffering yet hopeful people, and a culture rich but sabotaged. In 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, presumably, the culture really had a renaissance. And I had that experience. I experienced that in 1991. And subsequently, I visited Ukraine on a yearly basis. The last time I was there was 2019. Anyway, the dead almost inhabited me, but not to pull me down into despair, but to rise up with me in order to tell their story, which is also my story. So when I returned to the United States after that first 2-month stay, I began a process of researching, collecting, and photocopying text and photographs about the Holodomor. And there wasn't that much information out there. There's much more now. And piecing together work that paid homage to one of the genocides in human memory. This example from the series Fragments, the title is Satan All Around Us, Dancing, and the title really gives a clue to the imagery. Much of the work in the fragments is based on Francisco de Goya's works and also Byzantine Rite icons. It's it's on paper, and there's a mix of text and imagery, which I continue to do to this day. I'm going to read some quotes from Robert Conquest's work published about the Holodomor, The Harvest of Sorrow. And these are accounts by witnesses of that Holodomor. The first who died were the men, later on the children, and last of all the women. The most terrifying sights were the little children with skeleton limbs dangling from balloon-like abdomens. Starvation wiped every trace of youth from their faces. There were about 20 million victims of Stalin's bloody purges and repressions. An estimated 5 to 7 million Ukrainians died of starvation during the famine. It was a famine unique in history. It was not caused by drought, pestilence, or other natural factors, but by a ruthless, deliberate political policy of extermination. The central fact about this famine is it did not have to happen. Stalin himself proclaimed that the total yield of grain in 1932 in Ukraine was larger than in 1931. In other words, food was available. However, the state systematically confiscated it. The despot's commandments allude to Stalin's commandments in this piece. Stalin ordered the expropriation of all foodstuff and grain. His henchmen carried out these orders beyond belief, and the result was mass murder by decree. The Soviet press told glorious tales of accomplishment, super propaganda, which continues today in Russia through Putin. New industrial combinats opened in the Urals, in Siberia, everywhere. Collectivization 100% complete in one province after another. Open letters of thanks to Stalin for new factories, new housing projects, all fabricated lies. What Price Paradise is the title of this artwork, which includes false images of well-being and money. At the center, the image of death and dying. Stalin maintained that it took a famine to show Ukrainians who was master. It had cost millions of lives, and the collective farm was supposed to stay forever. He considered he had won the war. Death, a common sight in Ukraine. And the work here, I think, is self-explanatory. I used photocopies of archival photographs about the Holodomor and worked them in with Christian imagery. Passports were not issued, and people in villages were not allowed to leave. They starved in the villages by the millions, while the Soviet government in those years was selling over 1 million metric tons of grain on the Western markets. As the famine raged, it went largely ignored or misreported. Many in the West bought into the Soviet press that told glorious tales of accomplishment. Propaganda, we have that now. And Western governments who knew about the famine chose to ignore it so as not to jeopardize their relations with the Soviet government. Shamefully, American correspondent Walter Duranty knowingly misreported in the New York Times, writing, "There is no actual starvation, but there is widespread mortality from diseases due to malnutrition." He did this to have a wonderful lifestyle in Moscow, as he was the reporter on the Soviet Union for the New York Times. And he won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting of that time, which Ukrainian communities are trying for that to be revoked. The truth, the real scope of the nature of this mass starvation that was orchestrated a genocidal famine was bravely reported in some quarters, and most notably by journalist Malcolm Muggeridge. In the early summer of 1933, he reported on witnessing the battle that is going on between the government and the peasants. The battlefield is as desolate as in any war and stretches wider. On the one side, millions of starving peasants, their bodies often swollen from lack of food. On the other, soldier members of Stalin. They have gone over the country like a swarm of locusts and taken away everything edible. They have shot or exiled thousands of peasants, sometimes whole villages. They had reduced of the most fertile land in the world to a melancholy desert. And this is what I try to show in this work, a barren land of suffering with no redemption in sight. Corpses piled up were hauled away and dumped into mass graves. The huddled figures here in Stalin's Vixen return portray a nation's collective grieving that resounded years later when the mass graves were found and the dead finally acknowledged. And this was happening in 1991 when the Soviet Union fell. Graves were opened. The recounting of witnesses is very important in Robert Conquest's book, Harvest of Despair. And I want to quote this witness: "On battlefield, men die quickly. They fight back. They are sustained by fellowship and a sense of duty. Here, I saw people dying in solitude by slow degrees, dying hideously without the excuse of sacrifice for a cause. They had been trapped and left to starve by a political decision made in a far-off capital around conference and banquet tables. There was not even the consolation of the inevitable to relieve the horror." Maybe this sounds familiar in recent times. So the Soviet Union has crumbled, but Russia has returned. Ukraine has survived and hopefully will. The recent election will probably direct the future of Ukraine. August Subterny, a notable historian, claims that the Holodomor was to be for the Ukrainians, and it is, what the Holocaust was to the Jews and the massacres of 1915 for the Armenians. A tragedy of unfathomable proportions. It traumatized the nation leaving it with deep social, psychological, political, and demographic scars. Another witness, our national trauma has never been properly discussed and time alone cannot heal it. What we need is an honest exposure of our wounds to the sun. Otherwise, they will rot. And there have been books written about this, notably Anne Applebaum, The Red Famine, including Conquest book, lots of documentary films, which is welcome information. From this point on, I'll go through these images quickly. They are part of another kind of icon, which I did about 30 of these. And they are 9 by 12 inches. They're all the same size. And when they are viewed in groups, they relentlessly repeat the collective suffering and death of the Holodomor. And singly, they remind one, hopefully, the viewer of the individual that was a victim. And the number of victims was staggering. The title of this is Another Crucifixion. In each one of these images, a photocopy of archival photos of the victims, notably the children, is worked in with Christian iconography. Okay, this is another example with all sorts of Soviet pins around the frame. The material that is used comes from everyday adornments and family heirlooms like the embroideries, carved frames, handicraft that gives identity and bonding to this large Ukrainian national group. And frames are painted black as if in funereal processions. Here, the mother and child is superimposed over Madonna and child. And the money around the frame is the Soviet rubles, the selling of a nation. Along the frame, which usually elaborates on the life of the saint, there is a wooden relief form of an empty village house, totally abandoned and lifeless. The wood frame is torched, the torching an obvious link to the famine when those who would not comply with Stalin's dictums found themselves burned out of ancestral homes. These are just comments made by people who have the work in their collections. So I'm not going to spend time on that, but just to mention again that in making these works, really strive to make a statement that reaches beyond the specific Ukrainian nation. A larger statement about humanity and inhumanity, about rebirth. Another example of mother and child. And this is in a carved Ukrainian frame and embroidery and gold leafed over the face of one of the Holodomor victims. So now I come to the work that is more current, and I end with this. This work is very large, and it's the kind of process that I use now by combining text and metaphoric images of nature, which I find to be healing, and figuration, drawing and painting and all sorts of mixed media. The work here is 48 inches high and 96 inches wide. And you can see, well, you might not be able to see, but when you encounter the work, there are layers and there's a veiling so that from a distance, it alludes to grass growing. And when one moves closer, there are hidden elements, collages of writings and photographs of particular events. And this event happens to be the Holodomor. I quote Vasily Grossman, who witnessed the Holodomor in Ukraine and wrote a book, and one chapter was devoted to the Holodomor. And the one quote that really set this painting to be produced is, "Where has that life gone? And what has become of all that awful torment and torture? Can it really be that no one will ever answer for everything that has happened, that it all will be forgotten without even any words to commemorate it, that the grass will grow over it?" And it is a work that I do continuously of veiling certain information and then also wanting to remember it. So it's remembrance, and the grass need not grow over it, except that nature oftentimes provides a protective veil and is restorative, regenerative, and healing. I will end with a quote from one of Goya's Disasters of War, where the underneath the work, it says, "One can't look, but one must look. And then with respect to the past, one must move forward." And that is what, even in today's tragic war in Ukraine, this is what we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lydia. And many thanks to Candice and to Susan and Lydia for your presentations. We're going to open it up to questions here in a minute, but I'm wondering if the three of you have questions for each other first, or any comments that you might want to make. Hold on, let me figure out how to get this. So get all of your faces on there. Or any questions about each other's projects or work. I've got a couple, but I'll just zip up and let you all talk.
I had a question for Susan. Susan, I was wondering what the status of the project is now with the eyes, and if it's only in the one community or has it expanded to other communities. I was really intrigued also by the one where, you know, it was like a banner, because that implies that it can be also transportable.
Thank you so much for your question. The project is ongoing, and at this time, all those images are still there, but slowly, the families are being expelled, forcibly expelled. And so the new date for 5 of the main families that I've been working with in this little section of Silwan is January, and that's their last final appeal to the Supreme Court. So the community will be destroyed. It's hard to describe, because there's a military presence is very, very intense there, and as Palestinians are being expelled, Jewish settlers are moved in, and they never go outside without a military presence, without a guard. So it's very, very violent, and there's military presence all the time. So the very last set of eyes most likely will be, if it happens, the eyes of the blind man, who consented to be healed by Jesus in the Silwan pools. And the Silwan pools are in Silwan, and the eyes overlook it. And Palestinians are denied access now to the Silwan pools, because Israel has taken it over, as part of their biblical theme park colonization, using heritage tourism as a kind of a veil for colonizing Silwan. And I've been working to develop relationships with anti-Zionist Christian organizers. Christians are the largest group of Zionists that exist, the fastest growing group of Zionists that exist. And most of the tourists to Israel are Christian pilgrims, Christians. And so there's a lot of organizing that's geared towards trying to raise awareness and educate people. When you're in Silwan, the tourists don't know actually that they're in an ancient Palestinian village that's being brutally dispossessed and expelled. So
yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
One of the things that struck me in listening to all three talks is the cruelty of the colonial system, the cruelty of displacing indigenous inhabitants from the land, of taking away the resources, of essentially making native seeds extinct, and undermining the ability of the people to feed themselves. And that is happening right now as we speak in Palestine. It has happened across this nation with the native people. It's probably happening in Ukraine as we speak, as this constant bombardment, and Ukraine has been called the breadbasket of Europe for centuries. But this process of stripping away the connection to the land is fundamental. And there are a number of things that Candice said, but you spoke about the language comes from the land. And when that land is stripped away from the people, not only does the language die, but the very culture itself begins to die. And you also used the term that we've become nothing but shards of the culture, but the shards still sign. And that process of breaking down, fragmenting, dispersing a culture is a constant and persistent process of all colonial regime. I've seen it in Palestine, it's happened in Ukraine, it happened over centuries in this continent with the indigenous people. But one of the things that struck me as well in your talk is, well, at least in Susan and Candice's talk, which is the healing power of engaging, of rebuilding, in Susan's work, there's a healing power of the children and members of the community painting these murals and gaining agency over their space, over their walls. And also there's a joy to it. The kids who are always intimidated by the soldiers in Silwan can go out into the street and kind of participate in joyful activities. And I see that in the land, in the Forge project too, these children participating in the land, becoming one with the land again. So it seems to me like there's a healing process going on. In the indigenous people, it's taken 500 years to get to this stage, to begin the healing process. And I may be wrong, and please correct me in that. In Palestine, there's no sight, no possibility of healing while the oppression is ongoing. And I think probably the same in Ukraine. But can you all talk a little bit about what needs to happen for the culture to begin to rebuild, to heal, to revitalize itself?
Mm-hmm.
I would just like to speak up very briefly because not being in Ukraine, until I was an adult. And but being brought up with the Ukrainian language and with within a diaspora, reading Ukrainian literature, music, I had a closeness to that, but not until I set foot in Ukraine. And I'm not talking about seeing all of it. It's a huge country, but the little part that I was in Western Ukraine, where my parents were from, I felt very much at home because all those metaphors and words and poetry made sense. And because that's where it came from. So you are very right that language actually is an art form, the creativity, the environment has a large role in that. And having an opportunity to go to Ukraine later as it was independent, and in Poland, meeting Ukrainian artists who were born after 1991. So they were raised in Ukraine without Soviet regime. And they were a whole different generation, very positive, spoke Ukrainian. And I have a lot of faith and hope in that generation. Sadly, the war broke out and many of them had no intention of leaving Ukraine, but they are displaced. So anyway, I've just had that experience where it really does matter, and the land, the place is very important. And why somebody would want to destroy that's another story.
I would say thank you, Lydia. It's nice to hear that. I would say one of the strengths we have as a community is that we weren't displaced, even if our land was changed, even if it was extracted from, even if temporarily it didn't feel like our own, and we didn't have legal rights to it for quite some time. And the land agreement changed that. But, you know, the way that colonialism works and the way that settler colonialism works, one of the most damaging impacts of it was shame. So at first, if they couldn't completely dispossess you, then they made you feel through the processes of dehumanization, which is actively happening in Palestine, it's absolutely happening in Ukraine. Through those processes of dehumanization, then there's generations that start to internalize that, particularly ones like my mom's family, my grandmother, who went to residential schools that were church run. They worked very, very hard at underscoring that there were hierarchies in humanity, and that there was a lot of, and the way that they would, and that shaming was very corporal. So people were punished for speaking their languages. They had their mouths washed with soap as children. So I'd say that it's taken a couple of generations, and it might take longer for some of that shame to be lifted around language, around dance, around customs. It was also illegal. So people were jailed for practicing potlatches. So what I showed was, even in 1912, was an outlawed act. And I feel like one of the processes that I see, one, Lydia, in your work, which is truth-telling, and Susan, in your work, is bringing a sense of joy, you know, even in the face of removal and dispossession. But also, you know, one of the things that I feel is most threatening is when these processes of dehumanization are believed, you know, that can be really hard to get through. And that's why I said, you know, even if we're left with, in some cases, what feels like shards of a culture, they still have points. You know, that's still a point of survivance. And it's been amazing to me, even what's been happening in my community in the last 10 years, just 10 years, you know, has made a huge, huge shift.
Yes, I think freedom helps a lot. So, you know, when Ukraine was independent and not perfect, but it was moving toward democracy, it thrived. It thrived. It was tourists would come in the summer. So that really does happen if people are given the freedom and the means to be on their land and doing what they need to do.
I think we should open it up for question and we'll pass the microphone. There's one question from, where'd it go? Let's see what this says. Ibrahim. Can't see it. Used to teach in, Lydia, I used to teach in Ukraine. It's Ibrahim Norishi, he's one of the members of our coalition. Anybody have questions within this audience, please?
Thank you very much for those powerful presentations. And I just want to say just briefly that I was in Donetsk, where my mother was born. Actually, it's a long story, but I'm not going to go into that at all. But it is, yeah, painful to think what's happening. But I wanted to ask Susan what the responses are of the settlers and can the settlers and the soldiers, how do they respond to the eyes and the other murals in Silwan?
I don't know intimately because I don't have much to do with them. But I have read and I've seen their documentaries. They create films and different kinds of media because they're trying to promote turning this part of Silwan into a Jewish Yemeni heritage center. And they have different ways of justifying this. So you can't really do much in Silwan and Batnalhawa in particular at this point without one of the murals being in the shot, you know. So they've attributed their own meanings to the murals, and sometimes they've even claimed that the municipality is painting them for them because it's making things look beautiful. So it's pretty twisted. But so far, in this neighborhood, the murals have not been destroyed. In Wadi Hilwe, which is another area of Silwan, there was a mural that said a line from a Mahmoud Darwish poem, my homeland is not a suitcase and I am not a traveler. And that was painted out. So it has happened that some of the murals have been too threatening. And it's one of the it's an example, you know, sometimes you know, you don't know like that art is actually making a difference, but ideology is really important and is really powerful and it really threatens the powers that be. So that's maybe not a thorough answer, but that's the best I can do. Thank you for your question.
Anybody else have questions that they want to share? I want to just maybe touch on something that I think is very important in Susan's project, but it's very important for all of our engagement with cultures that are facing horrific traumas. And that's the process of witnessing, of being on the ground and witnessing. And Lydia referred to that. And there's not enough books in the world that can stand up against this one day on the ground in Palestine. I mean, it really isn't. It's when you see it firsthand, when you see the humiliation that the people are imposed on the people, it completely transforms you. So being on the ground and witnessing in any place is something that all of us should do. We'll never gain that knowledge from books. We'll never gain that knowledge from films. It's when you stand there and you feel the threat, you feel the anxiety, and you speak to the people, that's when you really begin to see it. And I want to encourage that all of our students consider that, not just in Palestine and Ukraine, but enter with respect into communities to be a witness. Not necessarily to be a reporter, but to open your eyes to the experiences of others. Candice, if I may ask, at Forge, how do you deal with outsiders wanting to come in? I mean, you've created this very nurturing place that is in many ways inviting. But my guess, and I'm just guessing, is that you kind of want to control who comes in. And you spoke about people have to acknowledge the land and the rightful owners of the land. How do you deal with that process of people that want to witness, but also not making it into not changing the character of the place?
Yeah, there's a couple ways we do it. One is that, some of the gatherings that you saw are Indigenous only by necessity, because they're safer spaces, but I think that, they create spaces of community. Number two, and my colleague Sarah Biscaradilli is working on this, is that for those that we engage in partnerships with, particularly non-Indigenous organizations, we are generating what we're calling an ethics of relation document. So it's shared values to try to model different relationships that, as Sarah says, are really founded and move at the speed of trust. So that we're not seen simply as a resource for others. I think in the last few years, there's been a lot of, interest in engaging with Indigenous communities as a way to sort of heal settler wrongs. And then there's been a lot of, I think, weight put on Indigenous communities in order to do this work, when actually the work needs to be done by the others. So, yeah, we have quite specific protocols that when folks engage with us, and also asking that question is really important, is, what is your presence doing to benefit us? And then the other thing I'd share is that when we do tours at Forge, we charge a fee unless it's a Native organization or Native person who's, just wants to come and see it. And half of those fees we split back with Stockbridge-Munsee community too, because we're on their land after all, and because we're trying to also model the very beginnings, even if they are modest, of reparations.
Great. I know that you're on the East Coast and it's getting late, and I don't want to keep you, but I'm wondering if maybe you could address, all three of you, what happened yesterday in the election, and that how that will impact your communities or the communities that you're engaged with.
I'll go first. Just very briefly, because Trump and J.D. Vance have been very vocal about how they feel about Ukraine. So I'm very saddened, and I hope it doesn't come that way. But I think that their way of ending the war is to give Putin Ukraine. That's it. So I did not expect the Democratic Party to be that fully trounced. So that says something about the United States. I have to figure that out. And Trump is not going to help this country either. So.
Candice, when Trump was in office last, I'm sorry if I'm interrupting anybody. How did his presence and his sort of neoliberal capitalist emphasis impact Native communities? And how do you envision that?
Well, one of the immediate impacts, of course, is the erosion of Native rights, but also particularly opening up traditional territories, especially very sensitive ones, to extraction. So the rolling back that Trump did right away of Bears Ears National Monument that they'd tried to protect under Obama's era, that happened immediately, as well as explorative drilling on the North Slope in Alaska. I feel like now with a very dominant, more of a dominant voice in government, that not only are those going to happen very, very quickly, I feel like there will be, now there's no checks and balances anymore. So I feel like there needs to be a lot more, there might have to be a lot more direct action fights, particularly not only with land grabs that will happen, the undermining of Indigenous rights, but the absolute devastation of any area that we've been trying to protect because it's very ecologically sensitive. Because, you know, their protocol, they operate on protocols of debasement. The other thing that is going to be deeply worrying is Secretary Deb Haaland had, of course, started work into histories of boarding schools, including starting to document the actual death counts of students. That work will likely not only stop, but I think that there will be a lot of other rollbacks of other protections and protections for Indigenous Child and Welfare Act, things like that will happen almost immediately, I believe. So.
We can't forget that when Trump was in office last, he recognized against international law Israel's occupation of Jerusalem and the Golan Heights and moved the U.S. Embassy there. So in many ways, I have tremendous fear of what's going to come in the next 4 years or 8 years in Palestine. I mean, Palestinians have lived through a year of absolute horror, a year of genocide. And the images of famine that Lydia was showing just reminding me of images of children of Gaza. So what acts of survivance do we need to begin to prepare to resist, to survive the onslaught that we will experience in the next 4 years? Anybody want to reflect on what we need to do as individuals and as communities?
Well, I think what is required is really careful and vigilance. I think that as a society here in the United States, we were blind to a lot of what was happening, and just let things go in a certain direction, little by little. So here we are. So like what you said, and I think people, presidents, Putin certainly, they say what they want to do. It's just that it's so horrible that we pretend that they don't mean it, or it's not worth, calling them on it or reacting in any serious way. So they're given permission to just go that way. So I guess, not that people were silent, but I think people need to speak to power. And journalists really need to rise up to the occasion. No. I have no other great ideas. Because I keep thinking, so this is how it happens. I was trying to think, because my parents were World War II refugees. How did people accept what was happening in Europe? How could that happen? How could there be this, horrible Nazi regime?
And I have a fear that we're so utterly unprepared that we don't know what to do. Even on a topic that Trump and his supporters have sort of been repeating, which is the deportation of migrants. We have no plan. We have no plan to resist. So I don't know. I think I'm speaking to an audience that probably cares about this stuff deeply, but I think we need to begin to resist. We need to speak truth to power even more assertively than ever, and be prepared for the consequences.
Yes, if there were more people doing that, then it would work. I think if, a lone voice just gets smashed.
Well, I want to thank you all, each and every one of you, for the work that you do, for the care that you share with your communities, and for being with us tonight and sharing your thoughts and experiences with our community here at the University of San Diego. I'm really grateful for your presence and for the wisdom that you brought to us. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All righty. And thank you for this audience. I appreciate your presence very much as well. And wish you all a good night. Thank you all.